Welcome back to Lecture 1, the Introduction to the Study of Revelation, Part 3, Rhetoric and Style. Besides the strategy of the two great cycles of visions, each with its three series of sevens, John employs other well-known rhetorical strategies in order to persuade his audience and shape their perception of the world. Considerations of rhetoric help us to understand not just what a text or speech says, but how it goes about saying it. The focus is on what a text does in the midst of its audience. David de Silva has written a superb study of the rhetorical texture of the Apocalypse in his Seeing Things John's Way. As a current leader in a certain kind of socio-rhetorical criticism of New Testament writings, as well as being a leader in social scientific examinations of New Testament texts, he reminds us that the ancient rhetorical training focused on three kinds of proof in order to persuade the audience: logos, pathos, and ethos. Ethos is about the credentials of the speaker. John is commissioned by the risen Jesus and conveys a divine prophetic message through the writing of his visions. God is ultimately the source of the message. The grid of pathos helps us to see how John creates sympathies for the murdered witnesses or the oppressed woman and her child and children in chapter 12, and antipathies of aversion and indignation toward the monstrosities and vulgarities of evil, see chapters 13 and 17, and their imminent demise, chapter 18. These contrasting characters shape the reader's commitments by attracting them to God and his allies and alienating them from God's opponents and what they represent. We are also, as an audience, swept up into the ecstatic grandeur and overwhelming gratitude of the many hymns of praise that frame many episodes and function as transitional experiences. Logos is more complicated because Revelation conveys imagery through symbols and word pictures. We'll see the discussion below on how to interpret Revelation's symbolism. Kester explains, Revelation captures the attention of readers through its word pictures. Ideas often find their most powerful expressions when you seem to see what you describe and bring it vividly before the eyes of your audience, so that the attention is drawn to the enthralling effect of the imagination. Instead of defining evil abstractly, John pictures a dragon threatening a pregnant woman. When critiquing imperial rule, he describes a seven-headed beast dominating the nations and slaughtering the saints. When offering hope for an unseen future, he provides a visual tour of the New Jerusalem with its gem-like splendor. Through his use of language, he takes you along with him and turns hearing into sight. The logic of Revelation presupposes that John's audience already submits to the authority of Jesus Christ as the supreme revelation of who God is and how God acts in the world. From this presupposition, John is able to guide the audience into a deeper allegiance in the face of social pressures and the potential, although temporary, loss of status and even life itself. All of this is weighed on the balance of hope for divine intervention and ultimate judgment for the vindication and recompense. John projects a vision of heavenly morality and a divine economy, the value of which is guaranteed by the ransom of the Lamb, and the dividends of which are paid in the New Jerusalem. First-person narration. Part of John's strategy is his first-person narration. John is both a participant and an observer of the story. However, John's perspective extends far beyond that of his readers. Harry Meyer speaks insightfully on this point. The rhetorical power of the use of first person in the book of Revelation can hardly be overemphasized. First-person narrative draws us into the storyline of the Apocalypse by inviting us to witness with John what he saw. John's eyes become our eyes, and his ears our ears. We are caught up not only in what he sees and hears, and we might add how he sees it and hears it, but also in the time he inhabits. The first century equivalent to on-the-scene reporting adds a sense of urgency and vividness to the text. John here is present tensely, somewhere between what was, is and will be, impossibly inhabiting present and future at once, and thereby offering his audience the gift of time travel. John does not want to undertake the apocalyptic journey by himself. He wants to take his audience with him. Furthermore, John, as our guide, shapes and frames what and how we see. He is the visionary who is selecting what he records, how he arranges the material, and with what accent, so to speak, it is conveyed. Harry Meyer articulates this brilliantly, and he deserves to be heard at length. John draws us into his perspective affectively as well as cognitively. His emotions loom large in the apocalypse. This story calls on us not only to see and hear with John, but also to identify with him emotionally. John does all he can to compel us to see things as he does. His visions do not stand open to any interpretation. Always on hand to interpret what he sees for us, John gives us what he considers as the correct understanding. We see here, for example, especially in Revelation 13:18 and the naming of the number of the beast, John's interpretation, but perhaps more importantly, an ingenious strategy of drawing the audience into participation with his vision and of cementing John's trustworthiness into place. John the impresario also appears when he interrupts apocalyptic performances with offstage narrative commentary. He may claim to be overcome with emotion at what he is seeing, but he never loses his head. He retains a firm hold on the drama and insists on his leading role by keeping us abreast of the action or even keeping us from full knowledge of things. Always the trustworthy apocalyptic guide, John punctuates the narrative sequence of events with editorial markers. For example, he enumerates the three woes prophesied at 8:13, 9:12, 11:14. The third woe is performed instead of marked in chapter 18. And he interprets visions as calls for endurance or understanding. By offering explanations to account for the waves of violence that crash through the narrative, he assures his audience that the earth-shattering violence revealed to his has direction and purpose. It is easy to forget what John claims to be doing in the apocalypse is simply reading off the contents of a scroll or two, see chapters 5 and 10, and that he is merely its faithful mouthpiece. But these examples show that John is doing more than reciting what he reads. Other commentary is more deeply embedded in the narrative, most often in relative clauses, and again shows how much John retains control over the content of the apocalypse, usually taking the form of short phrases embedded in the midst or at the end of sentences describing a vision. Both their presence and their importance in shaping the expectations and understanding of the audience easily slips by, unacknowledged. In John's vision of the heavenly throne room, for example, he writes, "I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and 7 eyes," and then concludes, "which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth." Here, John tightly interweaves vision and interpretation. Strictly speaking, the vision is part of the revelation, but John has positioned his description so that it easily presents itself as belonging to the revelation also. This is playful ambiguity, but it has a powerful effect. When this ambiguity is multiplied throughout the narrative, the audience, by subtle degrees, is brought around to a new way of seeing and understanding. In fact, just by reading the book, we have no choice but to see and hear things the way John chooses to tell them. We become colonized. It has sometimes been suggested that John lets his visions speak for themselves, and he otherwise gets out of the way of their telling. But as these examples show, John is very much the narrator in control, even when he appears only to be reporting. Again, it is not clear where revelation ends and interpretation begins. To enter into the narrative world of the apocalypse is to lend our eyes and ears to John. After all, we only see and hear what he wants us to. We may be dissatisfied with this, We may want to translate his narrative into another system of signification. We may suspect his motives, engage him in cross-examination, convince ourselves that we, wonderful to say, have discovered the key to break his apocalyptic code. Still, John does not easily give up control. For the time that we read here, the apocalypse, is the time that, wittingly or not, we become John, and thus find ourselves tangled up in his strange, apocalyptic configuration of the world. Oral performance. John's apocalypse is an oral performance. David Barr reminds us the original audience encountered it as an oral experience. And that experience determined both the way the apocalypse is structured and the meaning the auditors found in it. Kester explains the rhetorical force of such a public performance. Its public character adds rhetorical force. The text will communicate reproof and encouragement to individual congregations, yet what is said to one will be read by all. Recipients have incentive to heed the message because their reputations are at stake among churches throughout the region. The stakes are raised because of the chain of prophetic authority. The reader, 1:3, is conveying the voice of John the Seer, who is himself mediating the very voice of Jesus. The dynamics carry a powerfully performative authority for the believing community. David Barr says, the lector takes on the persona of John. The device is then pushed one step further when Jesus becomes the author of the letters in Revelation 2-3. The lector takes on yet another persona, speaking for Jesus. Then at the beginning of the next section, in 4:1, the lector falls back to the persona of John, which he maintains till near the end of the reading. Then in the midst of the sixth and climactic vision of judgment in the bowl septet, the voice of the Jesus of the letters breaks through. Look, I am coming as a thief. Divinely favored is the one staying alert and keeping watch of his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. This saying is so isolated from its contexts that some have suggested it is a displacement, and many translations put it in parentheses. It is, I suggest, an imitation of the ecstatic prophecy of the oral prophet. It is enthusiasm. The same kind of interjection happens at the end of the book in 22, verses 8 and 16, making Jesus present in the midst of the congregation gathered for worship on the Lord's day. Check chapter 1, verse 10. The prophet stands in the place of Jesus and makes him present to the community, Barr writes. The public reader stands in the place of the prophet and makes him and Jesus present. This also further supports the notion that John's apocalypse was performed as an act of the community gathered for worship, thus bringing the audience into worship time. Kester explains, although John is presumably alone when the vision comes, he locates the experience in worship time and expected his message to be read aloud when the readers met together, 1:3. Worship time links a book interspersed with scenes of worship in heaven to the situation of worshipers on earth, including both the writer and the readers. Barr elucidates the main purpose and function of the apocalypse as an oral performance. It enacts the proper worship of God. Since the apocalypse is performed among the worshiping community, it endorses one side of the cosmic conflict and sanctions the worship of God over all other contenders of devotion, veneration, and adulation. Barr writes, yet since the contest is one of true worship, the oral enactment of the apocalypse is a central element in the struggle. For it does more than describe the coming of God's kingdom, the narrative of the end, and it does more than portray the kingdom through worship, the liturgical materials. It brings the kingdom. It is the liturgy. As a story, the apocalypse has the power to take us in, to transport us into a new world. As an enacted story, the apocalypse has the power to bring into existence that reality which it portrays, to transform the finite province of meaning into the paramount reality of those who worship. It becomes a charter story that establishes a new world in which God triumphs over through the death of Jesus and the suffering of his followers. Because the kingdom of God is his true worship, the very enactment of the apocalypse establishes the kingdom in this world. This is precisely why we need to recover the apocalypse as a resource for contemporary worship. We need to reclaim the book of Revelation from the fear-mongers and the so-called prophecy buffs and put it back in the hands of God's servants who proclaim the word of God to the people of God, and those who lead God's people in singing and praying and praising and bearing witness to all God has done in Christ Jesus, and all God will yet do in bringing the divine promises to fulfillment. What is the book of Revelation about? It's about worship. It's about the unveiling of the person of Jesus the Messiah, who reveals truly and supremely the character of the living covenant and creator God. Language and solecisms. One more feature of Revelation is worth comment before examining some of the interpretive features of the text. From the time of Dionysius, which we considered above, talking about authorship, the style, diction, and syntax of the Apocalypse has been decried as poor Greek, even barbarous and with outright grammatical fallacies. We recall the famous statement by Dionysius, who was comparing the styles of those who he saw as the authors of the Gospel and Epistles of John and the Apocalypse. He said, "That the latter, however, saw a revelation and received knowledge and prophecy I do not deny, but I perceive that his dialect and language is not very accurate Greek, but that he uses barbarous idioms, and in some places solecisms, which it is now unnecessary to select. For neither would I have anyone suppose I am saying these things by way of derision, but only with a view to point out the great difference between the writings of these two men, the Johns." Several options are available to understand the reasons for the phenomena of the text. Some suggest that John thought in Hebrew but wrote in Greek. In other words, because Greek was John's second language, his facility with the language was limited, and he did as best he could. Others suggest that John was, perhaps unwittingly, influenced by the Semitic forms of the Septuagint. However, the kinds of grammatical infelicities and the placement of some suggest that John may have been making deliberate choices for rhetorical effect. John's facility with the language is evident in the multiple styles he employs, says Kester. Greg Beale makes several insightful observations about what's going on here. First, a significant number of these irregularities occur in the midst of Old Testament allusions. A number of expressions appear irregular because John is carrying over the exact grammatical forms of the allusions, often from the various versions of the Greek Old Testament and sometimes from the Hebrew. He does not change the Old Testament grammatical form to fit the immediate syntactical context in Revelation, so the Old Testament expression sticks out like a sore thumb. This creates syntactical dissonance. Just as often, the precise grammar of the Old Testament passage is not retained, but stylistic Semitisms or Septuagintalisms are incorporated in order to create the dissonance. The dissonance is one of the ways that John seeks to focus the reader's attention more on the phrase and to force them to recognize the presence of an Old Testament allusion. So Beale sees John as deliberately attempting to create a biblical effect in the hearing of the text, which shows solidarity with the biblical writers and echoes their style to evoke their authority. One of the famous examples of an outright incorrect use of grammar, a solecism, is John's use of the wrong case with a certain preposition. The Greek preposition apa should only go with the genitive case. However, in the introductory formula of the epistolary frame, when John indicates that this text is, quote, from the one who is and who was and who is coming, apa haon, kai haen, kai erkamenos, 1:4, John puts the relative phrases in the nominative case, but then switches to the correct grammatical form as he continues with, and from the seven spirits who are before the throne. Another example is an inconsistent solecism. John often uses a comparative adjective, homoios, which should take the dative case. John usually does it correctly, except where he follows it with the expression like a human being. Hamoion huion anthropou. Kester explains, the effect is incongruous, yet it calls attention to the unique identity of the human-like figure who was expected to come with the clouds, according to Daniel 7:13. Because of these more sophisticated features, several commentators perceive that John is doing something deliberate for certain purposes. The theories range from theologically motivated echoes of biblical style, as with Beale discussed above, to a more socio-political act of sociolinguistic resistance. Yarbrough Collins finds this plausible. It's more likely that John wrote a peculiar, contemporarily Semitizing Greek on purpose, she writes. Such an act may have been a kind of protest against higher forms of Hellenistic culture. It would have been an act of cultural pride of a Jewish Semite. Kester agrees that the peculiarity of Revelation's Greek style is well suited to its nonconformist message. One means of resisting the dominant culture was to deliver the Word of God in a funny accent. The very form of John's delivery is a refusal to play the game, so to speak, of the cultural forces that demanded uniformity and complicity in the systems of power and prestige. Interpretive features. Apocalypticism is heavily mythological and owes a debt to some of the great myths of the ancient Near East and Hellenistic world. Apocalyptic language is simultaneously literal and figurative. Apocalyptic metaphors do relate to real places, creatures, and events, but not always in a simple one-to-one referential way. All apocalypses have allegorical features, some more than others. But to push every detail for all it's referent in the real world is to reduce the entirety to allegory. Similarly, an overly literalistic reading can push their referentiality too far. It can miss their mythological, even poetic nature. We cannot always restrict apocalyptic reference to one or two or more contrasting choices. Apocalyptic language invites us to experience the world it creates, with all its fluidity and complexity and contradictions. It appeals to our deepest emotions, fears, and desires, much as do mythology and poetry. Truth here is not only a question of verisimilitude or historical accuracy, it has more to do with basic ways of experiencing the world. Do the writers believe in the unseen world they depict? They do. Do they believe that seers are granted visions into and tours of the unseen world? Yes. Do they believe that the specifics of that world are accurate as described? Yes and no. Remember that these are often visions that need interpretation. They symbolize things such as empires and kings. At the same time, even if an empire can be symbolized by a beast, it can be symbolized in other ways as well, and both are true and revelatory. The superhuman power of empires, angels, and demons is real. How it is presented can change. Frederick Murphy in his Apocalypticism in Bible and Its World. Understanding the book of Revelation as apocalyptic literature will encourage us to try to understand the real-world situations depicted in cosmic terms that it reflects and addresses. It will also encourage us not to take the symbolism, quote, literally. That is, to think of actual pale green horses or multi-headed beasts or thousand-year periods. These are all symbolic, but that does not make the realities to which they point any less real. Michael Gorman, Reading Revelation Responsibly. Finally, we will consider some key interpretive features of the Apocalypse. First, we need to briefly discuss the aspect of how to consider the text's use of symbolism. What repertoire of skills will assist us in handling the bizarre and often terrifying images? Next, we will take brief stock of how numbers are used symbolically throughout the Apocalypse. Finally, we will briefly consider the aspect of intertextuality of Revelation. It is a text interwoven with a myriad of other texts, both from the Jewish tradition, including the Scriptures of Israel, the Old Testament, and traditions from the broader ancient Near East and Greco-Roman worlds. It does not take long for a reader of Revelation to see that its means of delivering the revelatory message is less direct than prophetic literature, which more often uses some kind of oracular pronouncement. No doubt the distinction here is one of a continuum, as was noted above in the comparison between prophetic and apocalyptic discourses. Eugene Boring has offered a general set of principles that has become influential when considering the symbolic and even mythological language of the apocalypse. Following the lead of Robert Funk and the so-called New Hermeneutic, Boring distinguishes between propositional language and pictorial language. While the distinction may be overly simplistic, for example, certain pictorial language can convey some propositional content, there is some usefulness to the distinctions that he draws, particularly when he is commenting on the symbolic language of Revelation. So first, he says Revelation's language is non-objectifying. It does not teach a doctrine of the second coming or of the millennium, but rather holds vivid pictures up to point beyond themselves to ultimate reality. But this does not mean that it relinquishes its claims on referentiality, as if it were merely poetic expression. What John has to say does indeed refer to something, God's transcendent world and the ultimate goal of creation. Second, Revelation's symbols are tensive, evocative, and polyvalent. The language is not merely an objectifying code or an allegory. It's not a hidden code that simply needs a decoder ring, something that can then simply be translated into a simple form of propositional language. John uses symbols in order to communicate that which cannot be expressed in any other way, not to conceal something that could be said more straightforwardly. Thus, it is not correct to presume that John was encoding his critique of the Roman Empire in a secret language so he could smuggle out his message from Patmos to the peninsula. Thirdly, Revelation's language is non-logical and non-inferential. This does not mean that John is irrational, but that the ultimate realities he attempts to communicate shatter such language. Pictorial language can communicate the message expressed by a certain picture, vision, or symbol without affirming all the implications of the message if it were reduced to propositional language. Fourth, Revelation's language is not diachronic but synchronic. It functions not to relay linear logic, but to convey an impression. The coherence of the apocalypse is not the unity of linear logic of the type that it could be presented in a two-dimensional chart or list of propositional statements, but a web interlaced in different ways. It uses many different kinds of pictures in different ways, and one should avoid attempting to harmonize what appear to be conflicting pictures. Fifth, Revelation's language uses myth as a vehicle of truth. John regards the conflict that rages between the values of Roman religion and culture and those of the Christian faith to be a clash of transcendent realities, God versus Satan, which can be adequately expressed only in mythological language. He uses the term myth here not as the opposite of truth, but rather as metaphorical narrative language that expresses the reality of the transcendent world in this worldly imagery. In apocalyptic literature, dreams and visions, numbers and symbols all work together to convey a dramatic message. However, and this is absolutely vital we understand, these elements will only convey a dramatic message to those who are initiated into the system of signs. There is a danger, though. For those who are not initiated into the system of signs, the danger is that the uninitiated might substitute an alternative foreign system of signs. This is precisely what we have suggested has taken place with such interpreters as Hal Lindsey and other so-called self-proclaimed prophecy experts. Revelation employs a vast array of images, and not all images function in the same way. The symbol should not be flattened into some sort of code that, if lined up properly, could offer some kind of key to the meaning of the text, never mind presuming the code could be a key to the future. It is vital to appreciate that the symbols are not the message of the book. They carry the message of the book. A few comments from Bauckham can help put this into perspective. John's work is highly unusual in the sheer prolific extent of its visual imagery. The proportion of visual symbolism in Revelation is greater than in almost any comparable apocalypse. Revelation is really, from 1:10 to 2:6, a single vision. The imagery is common to the whole. Thus, John's vision creates a single symbolic universe in which its readers may live for the time it takes them to read or hear the book. The power, the profusion, and the consistency of the symbols have a literary theological purpose. They create a symbolic world which readers enter so fully that it affects them and changes their perception of the world. Apocalyptic images are written to the author's contemporaries in order to encourage them to greater faithfulness and assurance of divine sovereignty. They describe the world in which they live, their own time and their place. This is a necessity to locate the symbols in a real historical context. It would be a serious mistake to understand the images of Revelation as timeless symbols. They do not create a purely self-contained aesthetic world with no reference outside itself, but intend to relate to the world in which the readers live in order to reform and redirect the reader's response to that world. They're not just a system of codes waiting to be translated into matter-of-fact references to people and events. Once we begin to appreciate their source and their rich symbolic associations, we realize they cannot be read either as literal descriptions or as encoded literal descriptions, but must be read for their theological meaning and their power to evoke response. John has taken some of his contemporaries' worst experiences and worst fears of wars and natural disasters, blown them up to apocalyptic proportions, and cast them in biblically elusive terms. The point is not to predict a sequence of events. The point is to evoke and to explore the meaning of divine judgment which is impending on the sinful world. Revelation has suffered from interpretation which takes its images too literally. Even the most sophisticated interpreters all too easily slip into treating the images as codes which need only to be decoded to yield literal predictions. But this fails to take the images seriously as images. John depicts the future in images in order to be able to do both more and less than literal predictions could. Less, because Revelation does not offer a literal outline of the course of future events, as though prophecy were merely history written in advance. But more, because what it does provide is insight into the nature of God's purpose for the future, and does so in a way that shapes the reader's attitudes to the future and invites their active participation in the divine purpose. Learning to treat the symbols of the apocalypse with the sophistication and complexity with which they were composed takes a certain set of skills. One must be able to see the symbols as part of larger patterns of discourse and not to reduce the images to their constituent parts. In many ways, the kind of skills required are analogous to the skills it takes to read a political cartoon well. The message of a political cartoon is something that requires the viewer to look beyond the surface. Consider what is involved in the interpretation of a political cartoon like this one. Let's imagine for a moment that this image was recovered about 1,000 years from now in a digital archaeological recovery. It is brought to a seminar of doctoral students in whatever the institution of the university has morphed into in that millennium. Imagine how the bewildered students might discuss the possible meanings of the image. You can imagine student A, "We have surmised that this image comes somewhere from the turn of the 21st century. We have not been able to confirm at what stage these animals begin to move bipedally, nor at what stage in the fossil record where they might have lost this ability. We suspect this refers to a significant rivalry between those factions that identified themselves by equine competitors and those who favored pachyderm champions. Certainly, the competition of pachyderm equine contact sports must have been fierce." And student B would inquire, "Have you been able to determine whether this represents very large horses or very short elephants? They appear to be equal in size, and we have no specimen of either species who compares. Certainly those 21st century folk didn't send infant elephants to face mature two-legged donkeys. Then student A would respond, "Unfortunately, we are not able to find any corroborating evidence in the fossil record. Some have theorized that pachyderm specimens may have been malnourished. Others assert that this is strong evidence that equine handlers utilized performance-enhancing drugs." And the conversation would go on. When we perceive this image in 20th or 21st century American culture, we are immediately able to understand the broad message of the political cartoon. Clearly, this refers to bipartisan fighting of the modern political parties, the elephant representing the Republican Party, the GOP or the Grand Old Party, and the donkey represents the Democratic Party. These are traditional symbols that are ingrained in our cultural discourse. We know this precisely because we have been initiated into this system of signs. But what does it mean to read this cartoon literally? If we reduce the cartoon's message to its constituent parts, then it's not much more than a depiction of equine pachyderm contact sports. But there is so much remaining, and this reductive report on the meaning of the image leaves so many questions unanswered that we must reject it as both inadequate and even asinine. The same principle would apply to our handling of the many rich and multi-textured symbols of the apocalypse. To reduce any one of the scenes in the visions of Revelation to its constituent parts would be to misread and thus to misinterpret the message. Consider another political cartoon. What is this about? If someone were to say, "It's about an old man with a drug problem wearing funny clothes," we would immediately recognize the inadequacy of such a reading. This is about the United States of America's addiction to oil. Notice how it utilizes a common symbol, a recognizable character, to represent the whole nation, Uncle Sam. Did you know that our nation was almost named after Christopher Columbus rather than Amerigo Vespucci? At that time, the symbol of the nation was represented by a female figure called Columbia. Just because political cartoons use playful or comical images does not mean that they are simply comedic or amusing. Often political cartoons convey sharp critiques and solemn judgments on current social events. Consider this political cartoon considering the geopolitics of immigration. Notice how this cartoon uses common imagery familiar to comic books and superhero mythology. What is the meaning of this image? It certainly takes a particular stance on the current debates about immigration and so-called undocumented immigrants who are in this country illegally. It uses the familiar language of patriotic discourse, but clearly in an ironic and accusing manner. Often, political cartoons employ mythic images, digging into the reservoir of rich cultural traditional emblems. Notice how this cartoon connects to a particular development of the iconic Dracula. Again, there is a profusion of mismatched images. What is the point of this cartoon? Should hospital patients fear the threat of vampires lurking in the halls of medical facilities? We recognize the familiar symbols of American political parties here again. What do each of the characters represent? What is the message? Another cartoon that utilizes mythic imagery represents perfectly the power of the visual sign to convey a message through associations and commonly understood figures, types, and events. This one takes more effort to interpret and understand. Again, we ask, who are the characters? Is each character actually represented by a present person? Notice that this gift is from W, offered to Steve. Who are they? Notice the flag. Notice the large wooden horse. What does that represent? It is labeled with the words softwood deal. Unless you are a whiz about U.S.-Canadian trade policy, you probably don't have a definition of the 2006 softwood deal ready for immediate recall. This cartoon requires a very particular historical event to be completely clear. However, even if we don't know the specifics of the softwood deal, we are almost certainly able to discern the basic message of this cartoon. The deal is a Trojan horse. Perhaps you've never read Homer's Iliad. Perhaps you've only seen the movie Troy starring Brad Pitt. Or maybe you simply remember how your first home computer was wrecked by a digital virus that your tech assistant described as a Trojan virus, something that appeared to be good, but when opened or clicked upon became a debilitating disruption to the computer system. A Trojan horse is part of our cultural repertoire of images that carries certain negative connotations, regardless of whether we're able to identify the original source of the image. Apocalyptic literature often uses mythic and/or cosmic images to convey common associations for primal elements such as good, evil, power, destiny, and even the value of historical time periods. Consider the imagery in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. There are 4 eras of empires, which are represented by 4 different kinds of metals of the statue: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. This was an image shared by several cultures in the ancient world. The ancient Hellenistic poet Hesiod, in his Works and Days, uses the same imagery to represent the different eras of humanity, devolving and diminishing in value and virtue as time marches on. It is his composition that coined the phrase, the Golden Age. You can consider the many different kinds of images that John uses in the Apocalypse. The beast from the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns in Revelation 13 was familiar from the vision of Daniel's dream in chapter 7, but in the Apocalypse transformed and reconfigured. Consider the following political cartoon from the era of the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. The caricature is offensive and unflattering. It portrays the president as a dangerous buffoon playing with nuclear weapons of mass destruction, haphazardly tromping around the Middle East, troubling especially the nation of Iran. There are just enough physical features represented, especially in the face and ears, and stock phrases, even if they are distorted and embellished. The same could be said of the next cartoon depicting the 45th President, Donald J. Trump, at the time of the visit of Roman Catholic Pope Francis. He visited the United States in September 2015, about 3 months after Trump had announced his candidacy for the presidential bid in June of 2015. Here, Donald Trump is certainly not Trump the historical person. Rather, Trump is embodied as a compilation of vices, especially conspicuous in the context of a pope who is associated with the virtues of poverty. See his chosen namesake, Francis of Assisi, and serving the underprivileged. However, this is certainly complicated in this cartoon by the fact that the Pope has his own luxury airliner. But Trump is recognizable by common stock images such as the hair and possibly the squinty smile. These do not necessarily have to be accurate depictions of verifiable traits of the real Trump. They simply need to be able to suggest his personage and associated traits. There is something else to notice: the biblical resonances. The Trumpian idol recalls the grave sin of Israel's golden calf incident. The full meaning of the message of this cartoon requires competency with biblical tradition. This is comparable to the manner in which Revelation 13 draws on a broad pool of intertextual resonances from Jewish tradition, as well as the burgeoning Nero legends popular in the Roman Empire at the time of John's writing. This does not need to represent the actual historical Nero, but the legend being shaped for John's purposes. Another clear example, which will be explored more fully when we discuss Revelation 17, is the image of the harlot who rides the beast. Much like the conventions of the political cartoon, there are indicators and iconic signifiers that would have clued in the audience as to the identity of this figure. Here is the description of her. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. The beast is recognizable from chapter 13. Now the political cartoon begins to take shape. Certainly the colors, purple and scarlet, would have reminded John's readers of the colors designated for the senatorial and equestrian classes, respectively, of Rome's elite. However, the figure is defined by the moniker of the devastator of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Common Era. However, the image comes into clearer focus with the interpretive lens of the angel. I will tell you the mystery of the woman, and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not, and is to come. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Also, they are 7 kings, of whom 5 had fallen. 1 is living, the other has not yet come, and when he comes he must remain only a little while. Rome, as the city on 7 hills, became a common stock image celebrated in literature and enshrined on coins. There was a familiar image of the Roman Empire personified as a glorious woman. The goddess Roma was an iconic image on coins and modeled in statues. Often, she is portrayed as holding a sphere, representing global domination, or holding in her hand the figure of Nike, the personified deity of victory. There are just enough features familiar to John's audience that there were no doubts about her identity. And yet, the Queen of Heaven has now become a prostitute, seducing the nations and feasting on the blood of saints. John's political cartoon caricatures a common image, revisioning her in order to expose her. The political critique was scathing and relentless, and portrayed by an irreducible image, reconfigured and reimagined so as to expose the public narrative and replace it with a countercultural, subversive storyline that condemned the practices and ideologies of Rome. One more example will suffice. Consider the description of the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11, verses 3 through 6. And I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut up the sky so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Who are these witnesses? If we read this political cartoon literally, then there can be several options. Perhaps they're just 2 end-time prophets that God has appointed to do God's work. However, within the description there are familiar images and identifiable characteristics that remind us of Moses, recalling the plagues, and Elijah, no rain. Also, we may recognize language, 2 olive trees and lampstands, recalling the description of Judah's post-exilic leaders in Jeshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor as portrayed in the prophetic book of Zechariah, chapter 4. Should we imagine that God has sent Moses from heaven and assume that this is the reason God took Elijah to heaven without dying? The story in 2 Kings 2. Because some object that Moses must be excluded because he's already died, they insert the mysterious figure of Enoch in his place, the guy from Genesis 5. All these untenable gymnastics become unnecessary, If we allow John to be combining images with just enough traits to assist us in recognition of a persona that is larger than itself, John is characterizing the ministry of these two prophets by evoking traditional images and then recalling a codified tradition with all its authority and rhetorical substance. Revelation uses different kinds of symbolism in different ways. Thrones and crowns can connote power and authority, real or contrived. The primary imagery for Jesus the Christ is to be depicted as a lamb, both evoking images of sacrifice, but also transforming images of power and redefining triumph. The evils of the city Babylon can be depicted as a monstrous seven-headed beast, but also as a whoring seductress, and also as a burning city from which kings and merchants and sailors flee in awe and disgust. Virginity can be a symbol of obedience and fidelity, just as sexual intercourse can depict idolatrous complicity, which will be judged correspondingly with a violent rape and humiliation. More than this, many of the visions must be viewed as a complete tapestry. The images cannot be separated from their contexts. For example, the many images of devastation in the seven trumpets correspond to the imagery that either reverses Israel's grand tradition of creation theology or exaggerates and intensifies the plagues of the Exodus assault on the Egyptian pantheon and Pharaoh's idolatrous and oppressive kingdom in Revelation 8 through 9. The symbols require attention to the multifaceted context of John's Jewish Christian faith resisting the broader Greco-Roman imperial society. Symbolic numbers. Among the most frequent and important aspects of the symbolism in Revelation are certain colors and numbers. The colors function more like images than adjectives, and the numbers more like adjectives than numbers. Michael Gorman. One particularly noticeable feature of Revelation is the use of symbolic numbers. We've already given attention to the structural use of the number 7, but why would this have been such a compelling convention for John to use to organize his entire book? What other numbers does he use in a symbolic manner? Are any numbers to be read as simply literally? It will be useful for us to take brief stock of the various uses of the following numbers, 4, 7, 10, and 12, and their multiples and variations. First of all, 7. The number 7 is often perceived to indicate a notion of completeness. In Hebrew tradition, God created the world in 7 days. The Sabbath tradition enshrines the completeness of creation and the participation in the celebration of completeness through rest. See Exodus 20 in the Ten Commandments. Yarbrough Collins comments on the manner in which this sabbatical logic became an organizing principle in much of Israelite tradition concerning the ordering of time. For example, famously, Jeremiah predicted that the exile would last 70 years in Jeremiah 25 and 29. However, this is reinterpreted according to the sabbatical logic to cover a larger period of post-exilic struggle under foreign empires. For example, in Daniel chapter 9, often said to be 70 times 7 or 490 years. It is also Yarbrough Collins who notes that each use of the number 7 in Revelation ought to be considered in light of the particular traditions involved. For example, both the 7 stars in 1:16 and the 7 spirits in 1:4 evoke the Hellenistic motif of 7 planets. Yarbrough Collins challenges the oft-quoted dictum that 7 simply connotes perfection, tracing this unquestioned theory back to the work by J. Henn, who argues that the pattern becomes established in Babylonian tradition, but critiquing Henn's work as not persuasively demonstrating the theory. She does not deny that the number 7 was a symbolically significant number, and one that was pervasively attested across times and cultures. In the Hellenistic world, the number was permeated with cosmic significance, going back at least to the mystical mathematical Pythagorean tradition. There are different uses of 7s throughout the book. It is important to note both those that exist as well as to note those that do not exist but which are taken as axiomatic. For example, Not in any place throughout Revelation, or anywhere else in the entire Bible for that matter, will one find that the so-called tribulation is identified as lasting for 7 years. But besides the structural uses of series of 7, the seals, trumpets, bowls, and the 2 unnumbered series, there are others. Bauckham notes that Revelation contains 7 occurrences of the phrases the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end, in self-declarations by God and Christ. There are 7 beatitudes, promises of blessing bestowed upon the audience who obeys its message. There are 7 spirits before the throne of God. Bauckham also notes some other fascinating statistics. The word lamb, referring to Christ, occurs 28 times, which is, of course, 7 times 4. 7 of these appear in phrases coupling God and the Lamb together. He suggests that this means that the 7 times 4 occurrences of Lamb therefore indicate the worldwide scope of his complete victory. The 7 churches correspond to 7 lampstands, indicating a synecdoche of the temple menorah. There are 7 kings, which are correlated with the 7 heads of the beast and 7 mountains. The horse sits on 7 mountains, which can be a reference to Rome's 7 hills, but also could be a symbolic of the entire earth, 7 reaching to the heavens, mountains, in an act of self-deification, a symbol of the Tower of Babel, says James Resegui. The number 4. Bauckham is able to make this equation of the 28 as 7 times 4 because the number 4 is associated with the earth or the creation. There are 4 winds connected to the 4 corners of the earth. This is, of course, a pervasive identification associated with the 4 cardinal directions. Beale mentions several texts that correlate the Hebrew name for Adam as having 4 letters for the 4 directions. The Sibylline Oracles, for instance, the 4th book, states it is God himself who fashioned Adam of 4 letters, the first formed man, fulfilling his name east, west, south, north. 2nd Enoch says, I assign to him, Adam, a name from the 4 components, from the east, A, from the west, D, from the north, A, from the south, M. And in a text called the Hellenistic Synagogal Prayers, chapter 12, it says, Adam was a microcosm of the cosmos. All the world peoples have a 4-fold designation, peoples and tribes and languages and nations. There are 4 living creatures before the throne in heaven. Kester suggests that the most promising line of interpretation is that they depict heavenly representatives of the created order who call every living thing to worship the Creator. Other examples with multiples of 4 are the cargo of Babylon's ships at 28, again 4 times 7, representing all the products, 7, of the whole world, 4. The bloodbath, when the winepress is trodden, is 1,600 stadia. That's 4 times 4 times 10 times 10, indicating a complete defeat over all the earth. The number 12. 12 is a number well established in Jewish and Christian tradition. There are 12 tribes of Israel, and as a result, there are 12 apostles at the foundation of the church. In heaven, there is a multiple of 12, 24 elders, sitting on the 24 thrones all around the throne, who cast their crowns before the one who sits on the throne. The names of the 12 patriarchs of Israel are written on the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem. The names of the 12 apostles are written on the 12 foundation stones. We see that the number is multiplied by itself times 1,000 in the census of God's army in chapter 7, verses 4 through 8. There are 12 stars in the crown of the head of the woman clothed with the sun in Revelation 12, which are probably influenced by, among other things, the signs of the zodiac, which is deeply rooted in Hellenistic tradition and incorporated into visible symbols of the rule of Hellenistic rulers. This may be part of the convention influencing the image of the 12 stones that decorate, or comprise, the wall in the New Jerusalem, measuring 144 cubits, along with the 12 gates made from 12 pearls. The whole city measures 12,000 stadia. And the number 10. 10 is a number of completeness or intensification. Both the dragon and the beast have 10 horns. The beast wears 10 diadem crowns on its heads. Both horns and diadem crowns are claims to sovereign authority. We've already seen how multiples of 10 in the 144,000 or the 12,000 stadia measurement of the New Jerusalem and the 1,600 stadia of the slaughter and the pressing of the winepress. To this we can add thousands of angels, the 7,000 citizens of the city who were killed by the earthquake, being 1/10 of the city's population in 1113, and the massive 200 million, that is 20,000 times 10,000, troops of the hostile army in chapter 9. In light of these uses of multiples of 10, we can understand, at least, why there is a tradition that reads the 1,000-year reign of the saints in chapter 20, verses 1 through 6 as symbolic. The number being 10 times 10 times 10 would indicate the fullness, completeness, and intensification of a period that functions in the plotline as a period of vindication for those who have been murdered on account of their faithfulness to the Lamb. Giving consideration to this use of numbers in Revelation, and the manner in which they are often used to refer to time, raises the question about whether Revelation provides some kind of periodization of time, as is the case with many apocalypses. The answer to this question is no. Revelation does not attempt to divide up historical eras into periods, nor does it attempt to calculate when the end will occur. Rather, they, the numbers, make visible the will of God and Christ, which stands behind and directs all events. They are, as it were, the net in which the satanic forces are captured, surrounded, and confined on all sides. In the end, the function of numbers is a symbolic one, helping to create order and meaning in one's perception of history, the world, and life. Variations on the symbols communicate within the context of the system of signs. Take the notion of the period of intense conflict between the people of God and the dragon or its minions. The period of time for the reign of evil is short, 12:12. A time of suffering will last for 10 days in 2:10. It will be complete, but it is limited. A variation of a temporal period is represented for the suffering imposed by the trampling of the nations. 42 months equals 1,260 days. This period corresponds to the period of conflict with the dragon. 1,260 days equals a time, times, and half a time, which is the same as 3.5 years, that is, 42 months. This tradition is established in the book of Daniel. In the symbolic world of Revelation, it represents a broken 7, indicating liminal time, corresponding to the liminal space of the desert. At this point in the narrative plotline, we see we are in the in-between times, in the not yet redeemed spaces on the earth, still haunted by the vindictive campaign of the dragon, pursuing those who represent the obedient community of God's people. Just as with the description of images, lamb, dragon, white robes, terrifying locust, the harlot, the bride, so the employment of numbers requires that the readers give attention to the whole tapestry of literary context. Disciplined consideration must be given to each individual account of the symbols and signs in the apocalypse, and it is necessary to register the fuller context enhanced by intertextual allusions and echoes. A requisite and inexorable facet of the repertoire that encompasses the system of signs, as we have labeled it, is the wider network of texts and collected repositories of corporate memories, legends, and storylines that we often refer to as pop culture. Textuality and allusions. Intertexture remains a primary source for John in establishing the credibility of the future he narrates. John never explicitly points to Scripture as an external norm that authorizes and undergirds his moral assessments of particular elements of the hearer's situation, his diagnosis of the particular challenges that merit attention, and his identification of the salutary way forward. Yet, he still harnesses the power of these authoritative texts to render his message credible and persuasive. By recontextualizing the content of authoritative prophecy, John subtly invites these scriptures to lend their authority to his own visions. David de Silva. Revelation is saturated in common images from the diverse, intersecting cultures that surrounded the populace in Asia Minor. This necessarily includes Jewish as well as Greco-Roman traditions, along with those inherited broadly from the ancient Near Eastern context. Bauckham explains the intricate features of both intratextuality and intertextuality that make up the rich texture of the Apocalypse. In the first place, he says, the astonishingly meticulous composition of the book creates a complex network of literary cross-references, parallels, contrasts, which inform the meaning of the parts and the whole. Secondly, Revelation is saturated with verbal allusions to the Old Testament. Scriptures of Israel. Revelation's many scriptural allusions are the key to unlocking its mysteries. John's text breathes the air of the Israelite biblical tradition. The scriptures of his people are pulsating through his veins, such that almost unconsciously at times he can evoke well-known biblical passages. The relationship between the Apocalypse and the scriptural tradition of Israelite heritage, what the Christians refer to as Old Testament nowadays, is complicated. All scholars recognize that Revelation is saturated with Old Testament imagery and themes. A fairly recent study can say no other book in the New Testament is as permeated by the Old Testament as is Revelation. However, there is little agreement about exact statistics, precise sources, and specific methods of how Revelation employs Old Testament material. John seems to favor prophetic material, especially Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, along with the Psalms. John draws on several familiar themes such as divine judgment and protection, tribulation for God's people, false prophecy and idolatrous teaching, apostasy, divine battle of God and or God's people over the enemy, and the divine spirit as the power for God's people. John clearly employs creative reworking and recontextualization which results in transformation of the original image or message. For example, John draws on the rich developing tradition of Davidic messianic imagery, focalized in the icon of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, but transfigured by the arrival of the slaughtered yet standing Lamb, who has accomplished the redemption of a people from among the nations. Sometimes we can identify a particular passage that is standing behind one of the Apocalypse's allusions. More often, the images come in clusters and rush over the audience with a symphony of intimations and innuendos. One biblical passage is recalled after another, and this cluster of allusions gives the impression that life in God's presence includes all that the prophets have said and more. We will have to remain vigilant through our study of the Apocalypse to give proper attention to the many allusions, echoes, and inferences of the Scriptures of Israel. Ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman mythology. Apocalypticism's focal concerns have everything to do with the interplay of cosmic order and chaos. Central to apocalypticism as well are concerns with the structure and hierarchy of the cosmos and the transcendent archetype and forces behind cosmic ordering. Stephen Cook in Apocalyptic Literature. Along with many undergirding images from the traditions of Israel, there is a permeation of other likenesses, customs, and images from the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern cultures. Already explored above is the thinly veiled echoes of themes from the Roman imperial cult, as well as the presence of legends about the return of Nero. We will also need to consider the influence of the Roman imperial court ceremony on John's throne scenes, as well as the form of royal or imperial edict to make sense out of the messages to the seven churches. In both cases, we will interact with the impressive work of David Auney. A further consideration will be given to the broad assumption of ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman myths in the Apocalypse. Much like the consideration we gave above to the political cartoon on the softwood deal that employed the imagery from the Iliad, epic regarding the Trojan horse, or the cartoon that utilized the icon of the vampire Dracula, Revelation taps into the imaginative typologies of, especially, combat myths. These mythic narratives told a cosmic struggle between divine beings and supernatural powers, which would often take the form of a dragon or a monstrous beast. These images show up in various writings of the Old Testament. For example, in the Psalms 24, 74, 77, 89, Psalm 104, in Job chapters 40 and 41, and of course in the prophet Isaiah chapter 27 and 51, among others. Against the background of the cosmic battle, the Exodus can be portrayed as the victory of the God of Israel over the chaotic forces of the sea. Hear how the voice of the prophet Isaiah speaking to those who are in exile, that is Isaiah 40 through 55, portrays the Exodus deliverance in these mythic terms in order to announce that the new Exodus will take place to redeem the covenant people from the curse of exile. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? So the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and singing shall flee away. This recalls the earlier eschatological oracle from Isaiah 27:1 that reads, On that day the Lord with his cruel and great strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. A similar storyline pervaded Hellenistic mythology and was taken up by imperial propaganda to reinforce the triumphal sovereignty of Roman rule. This form of the combat myth was closely associated with the god Apollo. A woman, Leto, became pregnant by Zeus with twins, Apollo and Artemis. Zeus's Olympian wife, Hera, is jealous and so sends a great dragon, Python, to consume the woman and the children before they are born. Zeus carries Leto by the north wind to the island of Delos to safely deliver the children. Apollo arises and eventually slays Python. This mythos is taken up by Emperor Nero, who liked to fancy himself as the embodiment of the god Apollo in order to bolster his authority and the legitimacy of his rule over his subjects as a divinely expressed subjugation of chaos and savagery. This imagery helps to contextualize the heavenly portents of Revelation 12, along with the violent, idolatrous beast of Revelation 13 and 17. Conclusion. We have arrived at the conclusion of our introduction to the study of the Apocalypse. We have only scratched the surface on most of these topics that we have addressed. Much more can be said, and you are invited to linger with the footnotes and the resources indicated there to explore further the areas that interested you most. The most important insight, the greatest takeaway ought to be that this book, the book of Revelation, is about Jesus the Messiah. It's not a book about the end of the world or even the prophetic timetable. It is the revelation or unveiling of Jesus Christ. It is a book that proclaims the victory of Jesus, the slaughtered yet standing Lamb, who shares the throne of God, receives worship alongside the one true and living God, and performs the victory of God's kingdom in the midst of creation. It is a book that calls believers to a paradigm of witness to the future God has promised for humanity and for all creation. It is a book that calls the church to resist. We are called to be faithful and pledge our allegiance to the sovereign Lord and to the Lamb, and commit to living in the world according to the self-sacrificial ethos of the Lamb. Let us take up the challenge and enter into the blessing and study together the book of Revelation. Let's reclaim this dramatic gospel performance. Let's recover the vision of worship and wonder that is the Apocalypse. This concludes Lecture 1.